We should start this by just reminding ourselves what multiculturalism is not. Multiculturalism is not multiracialism. It isn't pluralism.
In answer to the question, I think he's wrong. I don't agree with Douglas's definition at all. Terrorism is not a cultural problem. Terrorism is a political problem.
No, and it's a religious problem as well. And it's a religious problem
as well.
In your
view, Douglas,
no, in the view of a lot of people, including the people who carry out acts of terror, who say they do it in the name of religion.
They also say they do it because of foreign policy, and you always ignore that bit, don't you, Douglas?
No, I don't.
When they say they do it because of Iraq, you don't notice that bit.
At least listen to the reason they say they do it.
Muslims coming to live in Britain and in Western Europe enjoy more rights and better rights, among them freedom of worship, than they do in any Islamic country in the earth here today.
As a Muslim female, okay, my parents might not let me go somewhere late at night because people are racist to me. They tell me to go back home and they hurt me. I got hit by 2 white guys and they laughed at me because I'm a scarfy, okay?
And I think the sort of myths people like you put in the public arena, and I've heard other similar arguments from BNP and all that kind of stuff, they think it justifies their argument by saying, well, Islam treats 50% of its population in a really derogatory and whatever way that you like to explain it.
Britain is giving aid to these countries in Africa. It's judicious for them to give this much money to these countries, but without even listening to their needs. So this only contributes to the white savior complex.
Yeah. There is a saying we have, damned if you do and damned if you don't. If it's the case that if we don't give aid, we'd be accused of not giving aid, and if we do give aid, it's a white savior complex. I think we've got to be very, very careful that we don't end up lambasting the freest and most generous countries.
From silencing Mehdi Hasan on multiculturalism to obliterating Muslim activists on racism, immigration, and Islam with undeniable facts, you're about to witness intellectual beast Douglas Murray tackle head-on with Muslim activists. These debates are straight fire. Stay tuned as we delve into a controversial yet heated discussion where historical perspectives clash with modern values. Grab your seat and join the conversation on a topic that demands our attention. Let's dive into the heat of the first debate. A person from the audience asked Douglas about multiculturalism.
Do you agree with David Cameron that multiculturalism in the UK has failed?
So back then, Prime Minister David Cameron criticized multiculturalism in the UK, saying it has failed.
This is the speech that David Cameron made this week, where he talked about the doctrine of state multiculturalism, that had encouraged different cultures to live separate lives. We've failed to provide a vision of society to which they feel they want to belong. And we've even tolerated segregated communities behaving in ways that run completely counter to our values.
Now let's see what Douglas has to say about it. He first states that he also agrees with the Prime Minister, and then kicks off by clarifying a common misconception. But first, do not forget to like, share, and subscribe.
Yes, I think he was right. And I think we should start this by just reminding ourselves what multiculturalism is not. Multiculturalism is not multiracialism. It isn't pluralism. For years, the multicultural policy has been able to glide along, in part because of that misunderstanding. Because of the misunderstanding that when you talk about multiculturalism as a policy, what you're talking about is solely immigration, or multiracialism, or so on. It's allowed itself an incredible easy ride, not least by the fact that this confusion has meant that any critic of multiculturalism has been immediately decried for years now.
On this, the host asked Douglas what he understands by multiculturalism. Now please pay attention, as Douglas said something that all of us have to mull over.
Multiculturalism as a policy, multiculturalism is the following. It is the idea that there is effectively no such thing as British society or British culture. There are simply different communities which you're born into. If, for instance, you're born into a community from an Asian background, you will be treated by government throughout your life as a member of the Asian community. If you're born into some other racial or religious grouping, you'll be regarded in that way. And that anything in that group could be different from what the norm in society goes on. Let me give one quick example.
And with that, we all have to agree on what Douglas has just said. We cannot deny that in the UK, there is effectively no such thing as a unified British society or culture. Instead, people from different communities coexist, and each adhering to their own cultural traditions. Multiculturalism, in its current form, creates silos rather than fostering a cohesive society. It's high time we consider this thought-provoking issue. Douglas further clarifies his point by providing a clear example.
Quick example I gave in an article yesterday in the Wall Street Journal. It's been quite commonly known in recent years, for instance, that girls of Pakistani origin have, at the age of 16, been taken out of British schools and married to older men. Now, If a white girl of 16 over recent decades had been married against her will to some randy old pervert who wanted to have his way with her, the state would have stepped in. It would have rightly said that that was an outrage. But, lo and behold, 16-year-old girls of Asian origin disappearing from their schools, nobody wanted to mention it because it could be thought to be racist. The idea was that there are different values for different people in society, and there is nothing more divisive than that, and I'm glad that David Cameron has called time on it.
Now let's see what Douglas's opponent, Mehendi Hasan, has to say, as it clearly seems he opposed Douglas. But before that, let's first ponder on what Douglas just stated, and I must say that's a phenomenal way to illustrate that different societies uphold different values. And for instance, consider another such thing: female genital mutilation, FGM, in some Asian and African countries. It might shock you to learn that over 230 million girls and women alive today have undergone FGM in 30 countries across Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, where it is practiced. And on the other hand, such practices are illegal in the UK and other Western countries. Back to debate. Let's go back to Douglas as he confronts the elephant in the room.
I mean, both of the left-wing people on the panel tonight, Mehdi and Jackie Smith, if you can still call Labour members left-wing, but both of them have done the same thing the left always does on this. You try to have a discussion about the failure of multiculturalism, and you have the BNP thrown in by Mehdi. Told, well, the BNP member congratulated him, at least concede, Mehdi, all sorts of crazy and horrible and disgusting people can jump on a bandwagon without meaning that it's the wrong thing to have said. Maybe they're just opportunists. I suspect they are.
Douglas is absolutely right, and let me quickly state this: discussions on multiculturalism often get derailed by linking them to far-right extremism. And thereby, it's essential to have open and honest discussions without immediately shutting down by such diversions. Now, back to Douglas, where he further elaborates his point.
Maybe they're just opportunists. I suspect they are. And Jackie then throws in the example of the EDL. Do you really think, Jackie, that was what David Cameron was aiming to do? I mean, a couple of, 100 people marching in Luton does not mean the Prime Minister of Britain should not be making a speech about a very serious matter. And this is the problem. The debate by the left is always attempted to be shut down by associating it with far-right extremists and racist groups instead of having a frank and honest.
Now, please pay attention to this part. When one person got up and asked,
the root cause of terrorism is bad teaching in religious schools, and that has to be addressed fundamentally.
Let's hear Mehendi Hasan's response on this, and wait until he said something that heated the whole conversation.
We didn't get into this, but one of my other objections to David Cameron's speech is the idea: you want to give a speech on multiculturalism, give a speech on multiculturalism. You want to give a speech on counterterrorism, give a speech on counterterrorism. Don't pretend they're one and the same thing.
Now, the moment unfolded where he stated terrorism is a political problem and not a cultural problem.
Terrorism is not a cultural problem, terrorism is a political problem.
Douglas, without missing a beat, immediately fired back with his argument.
No, and it's a religious problem as well, and it's a religious problem
in your
as well.
view, Douglas,
no, in the view of a lot of
problem.
people, including the people who carry out acts of terror, who say they do it in the name of religion.
They also say they do it because of foreign policy, and you always ignore that bit, don't you, Douglas?
No, I don't.
When they say they do it because of Iraq, you don't notice that bit.
At least listen to the reason they say they do it.
Agreed. So why didn't he talk about foreign policy in his speech on Saturday?
I'm perfectly willing to talk about foreign policy, as would David Cameron be.
Good.
But you cannot keep on pretending that there is no religious component to the terrorism, because there is.
I thought you said it was cultural.
Here Douglas drops the truth, as it's the terrorists who claim they're acting in the name of religion. To back him up, let's drop C-truth bombs. Groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda proudly declare their violent acts are for establishing a caliphate under their version of Islamic law. They even quote Quranic verses and hadiths to justify their brutality. That's it for this debate. Now we are heading towards more intense debate, and stay tuned to the end to find out how he destroyed each one of them. So first, a lady from audience stands and questions Douglas.
Okay, I want to take very quick ones then. Okay, this lady here.
I just want to make a quick comment to the throwaway comments made by Douglas Murray about Muslim women and Islam and its way it treats women. And I think that Muslim women are quite capable of speaking for themselves. And I think the sort of myths people like you put in the public arena, and I've heard other similar arguments from BNP and all that kind of stuff, they think it justifies their argument by saying, well, Islam treats 50% of its population in a really derogatory and whatever way that you like to explain it.
Another lady from the audience showing great passion stood up and asked,
Just a comment to you, what you said about women. I think, first of all, that's really misleading because you're getting culture confused with religion. And if you just take a moment to look into the Quran, you'll see the Quran gave women rights long before women in Europe started burning brass for their own rights. And you'll also see that actually in the Quran it encourages women to seek education, it protects us from violence, and it actually gives us rights in marriage.
Right, okay.
So you're very wrong.
Another gentleman from the audience, who got applause from the audience, flung another question.
You talked about how Europe has dealt with this problem, and what you basically have alluded to in the 6 minutes that you had are that Muslims are a problem. And you're from the organisation called the Centre for Social Cohesion, and it's worrying that to have you talk about these things in this manner. What you are basically alluding to is that Muslims are external to Europe, and it's worrying that you see it that way, because then that means there is no chance of there being any solution to any problem or Muslims being seen as a part of Europe and being seen as European citizens. Thank you.
Now let's see how Douglas's epic response and how he gives it back.
Thank you. Well, first of all, just to pick up on a couple of people, particularly women, who've said about the terrific things that Islam gives women in terms of rights. The first thing is, yes, in 7th century Arabia, some of this was progressive. In 21st century Britain, it is not. And you have to make that fundamental admission that the Quran is not a document for women's rights in Europe in 2010. It is not.
So for the lady with hat, he first teaches some facts, and when another woman argues about Islam giving rights to Islamic women, and how Quran grants women rights, and encourages them to seek education, suggesting that any oppression they face is cultural rather than religious. However, Douglas Murray counters this view by noting that while the Quran does include verses that seemingly grant women certain privileges, like access to education and some marital protections, but how this even matter if these rights are often eclipsed by other Quranic mandates and hadiths and other Prophet Muhammad's teachings, which enforce disparities in treatment. Like you can see in matters of inheritance only, a woman's share is commonly half that of a man's, and in legal testimony, the testimony of 2 women holds equal weight to that of 1 man. But back to Douglas.
Secondly, why is it that only Islamic societies and mosques in this country are places which teach and preach hatred of other minorities?
That indeed true, and he continues.
Every single week in this country, there are people on campuses who teach the murder of minorities. Last week, it was somebody who calls for the murder of apostates. The week before, at another university, it was somebody who believes the Jews are fair game. This is not tolerable. It is not tolerable for Muslims. It is not tolerable from anyone else. You, I hope, would agree with me that any minority that engaged in such hatred and bigotry should be criticized. Don't pretend that the cloak of Islam and Islamic belief and religious fervor means that people like us cannot say that people who call for the murder of minorities are not mainstream, are not acceptable, and have to be critiqued.
That brutal from Douglas, and wait for a second, and give it thought what he just said. As we all will agree by that all and those who disagree with this, I have a genuine question. If Islam is indeed a religion of peace, why is it that every major terrorist organization we hear about is linked to Islam rather than any other religion? Now let's back to another lady wearing a headscarf from the audience panel shared her personal experience with racism. But first, she said something which is very proactive in the way by claiming Douglas Murray as the problem.
British female, I love this country and I give this country. Now you're calling me a problem. I don't think I am. I think you are.
Then she demands an answer. She spoke about being attacked and called by derogatory names because of her headscarf, highlighting the prejudice she faces daily.
Second point is, as a Muslim female, okay, my parents might not let me go somewhere late at night because people are racist to me. They tell me to go back home and they hurt me. I got hit by 2 white guys and they laughed at me because I'm a scarfy, okay? Last point is to Mr. Fleming, about the point where you said about the religion, changing religion. Every person has the right to. No one says anything about that. But if you had a daughter or a son that wanted to become a Muslim, would you be happy about that? I don't think so.
Upon which Douglas replies, initially about children wanting to be Muslim, he says, no, of course it wouldn't bother me.
No, of course it wouldn't bother me.
Then he talks about the very crucial matter to talk about, and it is also the high time we all must understand this.
I mean, I would hope that if somebody has access... Look, what Fleming and I are arguing for is that People have the right to access all of the kind of opinions, all of the knowledge that they can. That means, among other things, having, for instance, access to all of the criticism that should be written of the Quran and of Islam. And if they weigh up after knowing all of these things and having access to all of them that they would like to become Muslim, I don't have a problem with that.
All right.
Now, I completely agree with Douglas Murray on this one. Freedom of speech is the cornerstone of Western civilization. It allows people to express ideas, challenge prevailing norms, and foster innovation and progress show ever. Freedom also means that people will inevitably encounter opinions and expressions that they find offensive. The appropriate response is not to demand censorship or special protections, but to engage in dialogue and debate. A notable example of the clash over free speech involves the publication of cartoons depicting the Prophet Muhammad. These cartoons, first published in a Danish newspaper in 2005, sparked global protests and debates about the limits of free speech. While many in the Muslim community found the cartoons deeply offensive, the broader. Murray emphasizes that, while prejudice and attacks are unacceptable, this should not be conflated with the right to critique ideas and religions through free speech. Upholding free speech is vital, but so is fostering a respectful and inclusive society. Okay, let's head on to another. But believe me, something even more interesting is yet to come. Firstly, a young man in the audience claims that the main reason migrants are moving to Europe is because wealth is moving out of the developing world, in form of debt repayment to the developed world.
Hi, I'm Hamad Abahawash. I'm a senior at Georgetown University. And my question is to Mr. Douglas Murray. And before I ask my question, I just want to say, you said no sound bites, but then you said the developing world cannot move to the developed world. I don't know what that's about.
I said it before.
My question is, since you brought up migration from the developing world, I'd like to ask you this. Every year, the developed world sends about $300 billion of aid to the developing world, but the developing world sends back trillions in debt repayments to the developed world. Now, don't you think that this is the main reason why migrants are moving to Europe? Because money is moving out of the developing world. Wealth is leaving the developing world and moving to the developed world, to build on what Lamont Hill said. Don't you think this is why people are moving to the Western world, to the developed world?
Well, Douglas first admitted that the solution isn't quite simple. Then he begins cut straight to the heart of the matter with these pointed rhetorical questions.
No, I don't. Again, I repeat the fact there are no simple answers. And if it was simply the fact that you could, I don't know, do a debt default or something and solve the whole migration issue, then that would be great. But it just isn't the case. You think that if for instance, all African countries were allowed to default on debt, that they'd become burgeoning, flourishing societies? You think that the problem across, for instance, sub-Saharan Africa isn't just unbelievable greed and theft by politician after politician?
And Douglas does not stop here.
You think that if you just wrote off the debt, that would stop being an issue and everyone would become transparent and clean in their dealings with money? I mean, the problems are much deeper than this. They're much deeper than just a simple solution like that.
Now hold on and see historically. Europe colonized foreign countries for various reasons, from escaping persecution to seeking wealth and economic gain. But it's all too easy to accept biased information and not keep an open mind. It's simply not true that only European nations conquered and colonized others. Every region has committed similar acts if you look back far enough. And think twice before saying that colonialism was just a Western thing. Then, for those I would say consider the Ottoman Empire, one of the largest and most impactful empires in history. And really, Turkey has to do something with the West. Now, back to debate. Fellow debaters sitting across from Douglas, another anti-Europe activist made a point which drew everyone's attention.
We call brown people migrants. We call white people who go abroad to work expats. This is really important, right?
Upon which Douglas have said something that didn't debunk all the claims, but it certainly made us all think.
Firstly, by the way, migrants versus expats, there's a very clear reason. It's expected, rightly or wrongly, that expats don't stay in the country and bring up their families and stay for generations.
The harsh reality is that these migrants falsely claim refugee status to stay in our countries for years, and after settling, they bring their families, exploiting generosity. It is a high time not for all of us, but for our governments, that they must highly start thinking to stop such lax immigration policies and crack down on those abusing asylum systems to protect national resources and integrity. Next, Douglas faces everyone on stage, taking a jab at Europeans and posing a question that leaves the entire audience stunned.
I think we've got to be very, very careful that we don't end up lambasting the freest and most generous countries. And I would just urge, as a call to, as it were, moral caution on this, urge you in this room and people watching, how many people have you made citizens of Qatar from Syria? How many? Okay, it's something worth thinking about, isn't it?
You could utter silence. Well, the reality is we Europeans and West people tend to be pacifists and liberal-minded. We naively assume everyone is as kind, respectful, and educated as we are because we turn our blind eye and avoid the truth. As the harsh truth is, we opened our borders to people who despise us. The very individuals from the East and South whom we financially support actually detest us and our culture. Let's face Islamic world often view Western liberal culture with disdain, considering it degenerate and pornographic. Many Muslims see the West as morally corrupt, promoting sexual promiscuity, secularism as theses, all of which are not aligned with their Islamic values. Now watch as Douglas Murray tackles an accusation aimed at Europe and to all white people about that their efforts in Africa are just a white savior complex. Shocking, right? A Muslim woman from the same debate named Asma from Kenya turned to Douglas and said,
Good evening, my name is Asma and I'm from Kenya. And my question is to you, Douglas. So you talked about us serving justice, and do you think it's judicious for these people in Britain, for example, you talked about how Britain is giving aid to these countries in Africa. It's judicious for them to give this much money to these countries, but without even listening to their needs. So this only contributes to the white savior complex that is currently a big issue in
Now here is how Douglas responded to this sort of accusation. He straight up wasn't having any of it.
Well, there is a saying we have, damned if you do and damned if you don't. If it's the case that if we don't give aid, we'd be accused of not giving aid, and if we do give aid, it's a white savior complex. I mean, we can all give aid better, for sure, and I just gave, in my opening remarks, what I think was a serious suggestion for one very good use of aid, which is to prioritize it in the region and in the neighboring countries of places people are fleeing from. But, I mean, as I say, I would refuse as well to see the multifarious problems that exist in your own home country and sadly across the continent of Africa. I refuse to say that that's, because of foreign aid only. It's so many things have gone wrong there, and you know that better than I do.
But hang on, I say. Why did she so quickly point fingers at Europe's generosity for the myriad problems afflicting her country, by the extension the African continent? Are we seriously to be held accountable for the political instability, corrupt governments, and tribal conflicts occurring there? Are we even held for anything happening in their society? Think this. And if you've made it this far, I insist to check out at this debate more intensely in our previous video. I'm sure you'll all will surely love this. And for this video, do like and tell your favorite part of the video.